عندهم دبابات احنا عنا حجار. القدس سكروها بوجه الناس وما عاد حدا.
I think we can get started.
Has he signed in? Hello, everyone. Can you hear me all fine? Great. My name is May, and I'll be your chair for our discussion tonight, Birth of a New Resistance in Palestine. And before we begin, I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land in which we meet today. We pay our respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any First Nations people who may be present here today. We acknowledge that Aboriginal sovereignty has never been ceded, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And as Palestinians and those who support Indigenous rights and Palestinian rights know that we have very close understandings of each other's struggles. I'm a member of Free Palestine Melbourne. It is a pro-Palestinian solidarity group. It is a community organisation that's dedicated to raising public awareness of the Palestinians' 100-year struggle for freedom. We seek to build an Australian Palestinian solidarity network by engaging in political activism here in Melbourne. And joining international campaigns that oppose Israel's ongoing colonisation of Palestine. Free Palestine Melbourne is hosting this event today, but if you would like to get involved, we hold meetings on the second Saturday of every month at 2 p.m. Especially when restrictions are lifted. We'll be going back to meeting at the Kathleen Sim Library and the Community Centre in Carlton. And we welcome anyone who would like to participate or show support, or who believe in a just peace for Palestinians and for Palestine, and believe in the ideals of universal human rights and international law. We also run a website and regular newsletter, so please feel free to sign up at fpmelbourne.com, so info@fpmelbourne.com. So thank you everyone for coming here today. Today we have with us a very distinguished speaker, Dr. Toufic Haddad. He is a Palestinian American writer, activist and academic resident of Sheikh Jarrah, which is a neighbourhood of East Jerusalem, which has become the front lines of the struggle against ethnic cleansing by the Israeli occupation. And it's really ignited a lot of the protests and the solidarity resistance movements we've seen around the world in the last month. Toufic Haddad is the author of Palestine Ltd, Neoliberalism and Nationalism in the Occupied Territory. He is the co-author and editor of Between the Lines, Readings in Israel, the Palestinians and the US War on Terror, and the author of Towards a New Internationalism, Readings in Globalization, the Global Justice Movement and Palestinian Liberation. He has worked as a journalist, editor, and researcher in Jerusalem, and we share with us grassroots insight into the current unified local and global Palestine uprising that we're seeing happening before us today. So I'd like to give a really warm welcome to Toufic and thank him for giving his time here today to speak with us. Welcome, Toufic.
Thank you for having me. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Welcome. Yes,
Okay.
please proceed.
Please proceed.
Yeah.
Great to be here.
We're so glad you're here. It's fantastic. Thank you for joining us from Palestine.
Happy to, more than happy to. I visited Australia twice and had a lovely time, and there's a great solidarity movement out there. So I'm very excited to be able to talk to you.
I believe actually that I met you one of those visits, and I believe we went around Lygon Street trying some of the Middle Eastern foods that are in the area, and I believe we went to the zoo. So it's quite a long time ago, but I quite remember it fondly.
Indeed, it was fun.
So I hear that you've got a bit of a presentation for us today and insights about what's happening in Palestine.
Okay, I was told that it was going to be more of a conversation, and then there were some questions that were prepared by that came across my desk in the last hour or so, but I'm not really sure who's supposed to be leading it. So
Yeah,
I don't know.
no, that's fine. I do have a few questions I'd love to ask you. Yep. Definitely, we can do that. So at the moment, it seems like the recent protests against ethnic cleansing in Sheikh Jarrah have come after years of growing tensions in East Jerusalem. Can you tell us a bit about the situation there?
Okay. So, I mean, it really depends how far back you want to go when we start talking about the question of East Jerusalem. Of course, Israel occupies the area in 1967 and immediately annexes it. Obviously, the areas that East Jerusalem is very important for it because it contains the holy sites. In the pre-1967 Israel, there are no significant biblical sites, which is obviously important ideologically for the sort of Zionist narrative about trying to make its claim that God gave them the land and it's theirs and nobody else's. So now at the time, they were very keen. They drew the map of East Jerusalem, sort of expanding it to sort of include important strategic sites in it. But they also ended up obviously incorporating significant amounts of Palestinians because basically in the 1967 war, the main enemy at the time that the Israelis were going after was the sort of the Arab nationalist movement, that pan-Arab nationalist movement in Nasser. And even, in what is famously known as the June War or the Six-Day War in more propagandistic terms. So the defeat of Nasser and pan-Arabism in that war sort of was overlooked the fact that what ended up happening was that Israel basically conquers and occupies and takes control over 1 million Palestinians in the occupied territories, creating this dilemma for Israel as to how it's going to be able to manage this population. Are they going to give them citizenship? If they do that, it takes away from the, quote, Jewish character of the state. If they don't give them citizenship, it's going to take away from the democratic character of the state. So they always had this question of how they're going to manage this Palestinian population that remained fixed on the land and was not ethnically cleansed during the war, even though it's important to acknowledge that about 500,000 Palestinians were also pushed on the other side of the Jordan River in the 1967 war. So when it came to the situation in Jerusalem, from an Israeli Zionist perspective, there's no question that East Jerusalem was going to be theirs and held on to as long as possible, no matter what the situation of the Palestinians were there. Obviously, it became this question of how can they reduce Palestinian connectivity to Jerusalem and thin out the Palestinian population as much as possible, taking into consideration that the situation didn't exist after the war and thereafter, up until now, to actually get rid of Palestinians in total, which remains a sort of longer-term Zionist ambition, but those conditions haven't actually arisen yet for them to do it. So their sort of politics have been to try and what's known as the sort of salami method, which is sort of to try and slowly but surely erode Palestinian on all aspects of life, demography, through planning measures, through Jerusalem identification, withdrawal, by preventing people from living in the city, through different means and policies. They basically wanted to erode both the West Bank's connection to East Jerusalem, as well as the actual presence of Palestinians in the city, as well as the integrity of Palestinian communities within the city itself, so that there's not geographical contiguity there. And actually, they very clearly set up, there were about 27% of the population. They figured that they couldn't tolerate an East Jerusalem that had more than a 27% population of an Arab population across the city, and they tried to maintain that throughout the. So their policies were aiming towards maintaining that. And of course, I mean, it was a brutal occupation for most of the years since 1967. Israel took heavy taxes and ruled East Jerusalem with a heavy hand, in particular because it was this important political significant area. And by the way, it was also the largest of the Palestinian cities in the West Bank. Now, after the Oslo Accords in 1993, we won't go too much into that right now, but basically they set up the Palestinian Authority in the main other cities of the West Bank, and they try and create conditions for kind of a drain of Jerusalem, so it's no longer sort of the political, economic, cultural capital of Palestine, and cannot act de facto as the potential capital of the Palestinian state to be. And a lot of money and resources and security measures, in quotations, and political economic factors are used to try and shift Palestinian center, cut off the West Bank from East Jerusalem, and put all those resources and create Ramallah as basically the hub where Palestinian activity, and that's where the Palestinian Authority is allowed to function. So on a more concrete, that's sort of the larger picture that's been taking place. Of course, we can look more specifically at what's been going on in more recent years. Okay, of course, the Oslo Accords does not allow for the Palestinian Authority or any Palestinian representative government to actually have representation in East Jerusalem. And in fact, during the second Intifada, the Israelis actually reversed what had been an undisclosed understanding between the Palestinian Authority, the Europeans, and the international community and the Israelis to allow for a Palestinian representation in what was known as the Beit al-Sharq, or Orient House, where you had PLO leaders, which were essentially the de facto ruling political entities running East Jerusalem, but underground, basically. These were the people who had actually negotiated in Madrid and Washington, and who the PLO went around behind their backs. Big figures like Faisal Husseini, as well as Hanan Ashrawi. So these kinds of figures had been located in Beit al-Sharq. In 2001, I believe the Israelis came in and they basically shut down the place And ever since then, the Palestinian Authority has not even allowed to have an informal presence. Now, of course, also the internationals allowed this to happen. You have, and as I mentioned, sort of a wide series of measures that have been taking place in Jerusalem to change the status quo and the demographic reality and Palestinian connectivity with the city. These include, but are not limited to, like a set of concentric circles of settlements around, like literally 2 to 3 main settlement blocks that encircle the city. You have specific settlements within certain areas to actually break up the contiguity within these circles. And in fact, all the events around Sheikh Jarrah have a lot to do with this, basically cutting a main access road on what would be the most inner circle of this, which cutting off what's known as the Holy Basin area, which is the area that has around 90% of the holy, the sites that are significant to Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. You have more than 15,000 Palestinians who had their identity cards taken away since 1967. You have over 100,000 Palestinians who are living in houses that are subject to demolition. That's basically because only the main way that Israel has sort of prevented controlled things demographically and Palestinian connectivity to East Jerusalem is through zoning and planning. So only 13% of East Jerusalem is eligible for, is zoned, which means that things can be built in these areas, and most of these areas are already well built up, and the property in it is very valuable and controlled by very wealthy landlords. So this forces Palestinians in other parts of the city to build quote unquote illegally, which means they become subject to demolition and potential eviction. You have, of course, Israel building the wall in and around Jerusalem. They built this, the wall literally snakes in and out in a very obvious gerrymandering fashion, cutting, including Jewish settlements and excluding Palestinian neighborhoods. So you have like Sharfat refugee camp, which is just, probably about 4 kilometers up the road. In that neighborhood, you have, it's a refugee camp of refugees from the 1967 war, who were the only formal refugee camp in Jerusalem that has over 60,000 people in it. If you just go a mile north, of course, the Jewish settlers are allowed in Nevi Yaqub settlement and are considered part of Jerusalem. So there's no logic to it except the blatant racist sort of apartheid type politics that are going on. And of course, when we talk about Sheikh Jarrah, it's very much the front lines of this right now, because there's this feeling that if Sheikh Jarrah falls, and right after it, around the kind of corner, if you look on the map, you've got Silwan, and there's other planned activity between Silwan and in an area called Wadi Joz. It would connect with already existing settlements on the other side, and you really have this inner ring that would force people out. So Sheikh Jarrah's case of just 4 families that were settled there for eviction and that were protesting their eviction, that sort of ignited this struggle, relates to a cascading set of fears that exist amongst a much larger set of people in East Jerusalem, and with enormous geopolitical significance around it. And that sort of provides the context for what's going on now.
I think you really touched on something quite important in terms of there are also other actors involved in terms of trying to drive out or ethnically cleanse Palestinians out of East Jerusalem. And I think the families who've been fighting back against this ethnic cleansing has really highlighted, especially in Sheikh Jarrah, like the Al-Quds family, who've really highlighted there are other interest groups, other settler organizations, other well-funded organizations who are in there very much so funding and using Israeli systems and the Israeli system itself in trying to force out Palestinians out of the area. Could you tell us a little bit about some of those struggles that Palestinians are facing in terms of that ethnic cleansing, and how emerging, I guess, Palestinian, young Palestinian people like the Al-Quds, who are voices of highlighting that and how it's sort of ignited that conversation. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it's important to acknowledge that, the ethnic cleansing is not new, as I noted, sort of, and it's particularly in Sheikh Jarrah, I would argue. I think the first attempts were in '79. And a lot of these cases are legal cases that have been going through the courts with different appeals and whatnot. Of course, you have a very dodgy set of networks that are behind this. It's not just going through the Israeli system, it's going through the Americas, France, the United Kingdom, and also like those dodgy Caribbean states where a lot of this money is that funds what's going on, this sort of, particularly for the front lines of this ethnic cleansing stuff, it's a tricky situation. Not a tricky situation. I mean, they're hiding where the money is coming from and who is behind it, because obviously there are a lot of dodgy things about what are being done here. I mean, to change the demographics of an occupied territory is considered a war crime. So there's no legal basis to it. The Israeli state, of course, and the Israeli Supreme Court is about defending the laws of Israel, which is about creating and defending a Jewish state. So we don't expect anything else from them, but we haven't seen so a fair hearing of what the story is with this specific property here or others. It's not possible inside Israel where you have a state which is, loyal to defending these principles. Part of the issue about Sheikh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And really, the laws are created in Israel to benefit the Israelis and the settlers there. It's there to ensure that Palestinians are essentially driven out of East Jerusalem and out of Palestine. I did have a question though. What do you think the Israeli Supreme Court is going to do regarding the homes in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan? What do you think the plans are being made as well for Palestinians to respond to their upcoming decisions?
I mean, I don't expect anything from the Israeli Supreme Court, and I don't think anyone 100 meters from me, which is, I'm looking at where all this is taking place, 100 meters in front of me, have any expectations. Let's look. I mean, when I was painting the picture of previous ethnic cleansing waves, Sheikh Jarrah, there's you have case, like I said, it wasn't the first case, and there are settlers in the neighborhood already, but this is going to be a significant push for families, and then there's 28 families that are sort of beyond that, right? So it's part of the historical memory of this place that they're coming for us. The salami method is what's been working. Well, how they've been approaching it. You had the case of the Ghawi family, whose house is now settled by some settler group and some folks there or whatever, settlers, and after they were kicked out in a very brutal fashion, like in conditions that were almost identical to this in terms of the way the courts worked and the police worked and all this sort of stuff. The family literally was living on the sidewalk for 7 months trying to get international people to pay attention to their case, but it didn't go anywhere. Before that, a few years, there was the case of also Kamel al-Kurd, who was an elderly woman, and her husband, who was in a wheelchair. This family also was kicked out in the middle of the night. The father was literally, and he had diabetes and terrible health problems. And like within a month, basically after getting kicked out, he also died. She also set up a protest camp, sort of just where, on adjacent land, and lasted about 2 months. And then she had to she packed up, and she didn't feel like it was going anywhere. So people very much feel like, they don't really have that much to lose. I mean, they're going to lose their house and their livelihood and their whole presence in the city. So it's a very serious, and that's but you have, a certain set of circumstances that also lead to a new fight back taking place now, which hopefully we're mildly hopeful. The minority has been able to have important successes. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that exactly. And I think for Palestinians, they've been resisting this type of oppression for decades. This is not a new story, but there has been a real concerted effort recently to try and drive out a large number of Palestinians. But I think for the Israelis, and I think in terms of the international world, there has been a bit of a change in terms of the language and also the voice of Palestinians being heard. And so there's been a lot of discussions about this new generation of protest leaders emerging across historic Palestine. Could you give us a feeling of who those people are and what kind of things that are motivating them?
Well, I'd be happy to, but before I say that, I think it's important to acknowledge that Palestine, and particularly the case of Jerusalem, went many steps backwards, not just from the Oslo Accords, but also from the Trump administration, okay? So, and then this was very triggering in many senses because there was a feeling that the whole cause is slowly but surely being deteriorated. And in Jerusalem, you had the, in addition to Trump moving the embassy and all that, and like there not being any significant pushback, and in fact, hundreds of people in Gaza who were protesting it also got gunned down, in peaceful demonstrations at the border. There was definitely a feeling of like, it's a scary situation and nobody is helping us and nobody is doing anything we can't rely upon anybody else. So I think, and because of also the isolation of East Jerusalem, both being under Israeli occupation, but also the fact that the factions have to operate much below the radar if they're around, and they're not necessarily around, and they can't operate or provide services or anything like that in any clear or open sense. So there very much is a feeling of Palestinians having to mobilize themselves and do what they can because and that's the basis of struggle, and that's the basis of the fight back that's taking place. And you have, remember also, you have like also everybody's been the last year and a half under Corona, quite strict restrictions. They've seen this coming down the pipeline. You have social media, which creates new conditions for potential organizing. You have, there's a feeling of, a need for a correction and a fight back to all the negative steps back that have been taken under the Trump administration. You have a whole new generation of Palestinians also who are, Oslo Accords happened 28 years ago. They had this promise in them that doesn't really hold water to anybody if they ever did, that they were a harbinger for anything that had to do with the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In fact, what we've seen is that not only is, okay, for people have sort of said for a long time that Oslo is dead, but perhaps more important, it's acknowledging actually, I don't want to go into the whole debate whether Oslo was successful or a failure, because I ultimately see that what happened, although history was not entirely linear with this in terms, but there was no real intention to try and create a Palestinian state. Israel had very clear interests in sort of, in creating an autonomy arrangement as a kind of temporary management situation. But what's interesting here is how obviously the international community adjusts itself and conveniently positions itself behind Israel's excuses of no partner to peace or Israeli security interests or a divided Palestinian entity, which basically allowed them to comfortably sit and basically bankroll the apartheid reality that was created by Israel. And not in a conflict resolution model, but in a conflict management situation. And actually, it's not de facto, it's not even accurate to call it conflict management, because obviously they're biased for the Israelis. On one hand, they're giving the Israelis F-35s and nuclear submarines. On the other hand, they're sort of, throwing crumbs of development aid here and there in a very transparent effort to try and create collaborators who might, go along with their plans. And so what's falling down, what's collapsing right now is actually this conflict management situation in and of itself is no longer sustainable. And actually Palestinians across historical Palestine, from the river to the sea, are now, find much more common cause, and all along they've Palestinians knew who they were and their identity and their rootedness to the land. But because of the divisions created by Oslo, because the colonization of Palestine took place in different times and spaces and using different technologies of control, and with some people, quote unquote, citizens, other people basically non-entities like in Gaza. Different mediums and different forms of resistance and different forms of fight back were developing in different ways in different times and spaces, pertinent to the structure and architecture of control and domination that was being imposed there. But because Jerusalem and particularly Sheikh Jarrah sort of incorporate the issue of Jerusalem, which is the religious, political, national, cultural, economic capital of Palestine, because this issue also incorporates issues of refugees and ethnic cleansing and settlements. I mean, you had the whole kit and caboodle in one issue ready to explode, and that's what happened. So it ignited Jerusalem, and then it spread to the West Bank and to Gaza and to the 48 areas. And it's very much a live issue that's still out there. And I think the folks who ran this thing, I mean, I'm not sure they expected it, but whatever. I mean, they're just you have it's not just what the Kurd family was doing, and I'm sure by this point everyone's familiar with Muhammad and Munir Kurd, who are some of the most public spokespersons of this campaign. There are others like them. Obviously, I mean, they're advantaged in the fact that obviously it's not an advantage to be in the heart of this thing, but I mean, Muhammad was in America. He speaks good English. He's a very good spokesman for, and his twin sister is equally excellent in Arabic on the local level, very, with a lot of appeal and charisma. And they were able to get the message out. Other communities, other communities have different leaders like that, of different variations of their charisma or not. I think what's more important is that we obviously focus on the main things. We shouldn't be building movements around people per se, but around the basic principles of what's going on.
This is the biggest struggle. I mean, this is a fight for a free Palestine. I think to add on to that, also Palestinians within the diaspora as well have increasingly, I think, been much more ignited to advocate for Palestine. I know I've been a Palestinian activist for over 10 years, and the energy that we've seen in terms of the attacks in Al-Aqsa Mosque and against the ethnic cleansing of East Jerusalem, and then the attacks on Gaza, there has been a real sense of push from the diaspora as well to stand in solidarity with Palestinians, whether it's in 48, the West Bank and Jerusalem and in Gaza. And I think there is definitely a role to play there for all Palestinians, but also all people who stand in solidarity with Palestine. I just was wondering, could you give us a sense of the political situation in the West Bank? In particular, it comes to mind the cancellations of the elections seem particularly outrageous, but also, the settlements keep growing. We still have the continued blockade of Gaza. Now we're having mass repression of Palestinians within 48. Anyone who protested, people are being rounded up. You've got the repression attacks against some of the key figures within the neighbourhoods of Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan. Could you give us a sense of the political situation at the moment, the feeling on the ground?
Well, yeah, I mean, the political situation on the ground obviously depends on where you are, right? I mean, but you started off by talking about the situation in the West Bank and the question of elections, which I think is significant. But I would also caution about, I think there was probably a lot of noise created around the issue of the cancellation of the elections. But I think, to be honest, the real blame here lies with the Israelis and the internationals. Like I was saying before, there had been elections allowed to take place that included East Jerusalem in 1996 as well as 2006, but the Israelis were not interested in elections taking place again, and they would never allow them were it not for the internationals who forced them in those two previous incidences to hold those elections, because in both contexts they needed these elections to legitimize what was taking place. In the 96 elections, it was about the general legitimization of the Oslo process. I mean, it was their first bait and switch maneuver going on. The 2006 elections was basically about legitimating the post-Arafat era, which was also equally important for them because they needed to have a Palestinian partner who was going to run the show for them in the West Bank, in the West Bank and Gaza, they were assuming at the time. because without that, they would have things fall apart. And they needed to, and they needed to even resuscitate parts of Fatah to be able to do that, because it was quite weak after that. And in fact, they had lost the elections. But when it came to elections today, they never allowed it. That internationals actually were like, well, okay, actually, we don't really care about Palestinian democracy. It was never really about Palestinian democracy. And in fact, if you looked at the previous elections, there was also an abrogation of Palestinian democracy in both of those situations, because in '96, they didn't allow for local elections. And in 2006, when local elections and national elections happened, they canceled the results of them. So basically, I think the situation in the West Bank and Gaza, and by doing that, basically the internationals and the Israelis were trying to promote and continue promotion of the divided nature of the Palestinian political terrain between Hamas and Fatah and the West Bank and Gaza, because they're basically using aid and military powers as sort of carrot and stick thing, and basically to continue the excuse that basically, oh, the Palestinians aren't a united polity, so why should we push forward any of these political demands that they're asking for? And that's why it's basically conflict management. And that's also why the international community is essential for that. And that's why countries like Australia and the rest of the Western world are key partners to propagating the apartheid nature of what goes on here. So when it comes to the political situation, I mean, that's the sort of macro situation. And then you just go down more, you go down more micro or more, lower levels, and you see what's going on, which is rather contextual to the actual context, because Palestinians don't have a unified actual experience anymore. Of course, they're all oppressed under the Palestinian, underneath the Israelis, and so, but the nature of that oppression looks a little bit different in each place. So, like I said, Jerusalem is like particular, West Bank is particular, Gaza is particular, and we can study those in their particularity. The only way to discuss them is in their particularity. In the West Bank, I mean, from my ability to go there in recent times, which was limited, but I made efforts to go there after the elections, but also after everything that had gone on. You definitely have a high level of anger and instability and desire to do something, but people are not really sure how to manifest it. Of course, the situation with the Palestinian Authority creates quite large complexities around how you struggle and in what ways you struggle. And I don't think Palestinians have a clear answer to that right now. There's not, you can't like initiate like in the first Intifada, it was possible to withhold your labor. In today, you can't. That doesn't do anything to the Israelis, because the Israelis have made you redundant. There is some Palestinian labor that exists inside Israel. 100,000 Palestinians go into work inside 48 areas, but most of them are villagers and not under the Palestinian Authority. And plus, if they're not working, so where are they going to be? It's not. I'm not saying it's not necessary, but before, Palestinians were an effective party to Israel's economy, and now they're not after Oslo. And then the question is, how do you take on this struggle? It's not clear, I think, but it's a serious challenge. I mean, that's also why we see the reduction of the kind of political struggle that we are able to see in Gaza has basically been like reduced to a brazen military struggle at this stage, basically, because like Palestinians don't really have effective means vis-a-vis the Israelis. They're sort of contained in this super controlled ghetto in Gaza, and they have no influence outside there. Now, of course, they're trying to build their relations with the outside world to gain effective leverage and win the, adherence to their cause. They have all the international resolutions. They have everything, but the thing is, what's lacking here is not Palestinian resiliency or demands for their rights or willingness to resist, whether peacefully or not peacefully or whatever. What's lacking here is an effective additional force to be able to actually have traction, to have leverage. And that's because, and that needs something larger than the Palestinians themselves, whether it's a much more shifting regional situation or a much more active international campaign to be able to actually put the squeeze on and put Israel in the corner and put the actual collaborators with Israel in the corner, because without that, Israel remains the sort of, this apartheid colonial state doing what it does with impunity, basically, with the military, financial, diplomatic, political backing that it needs. Palestinians are the weaker party. It's very clear that only after this last struggle, which threatened to ignite things much larger, because Jerusalem, we saw activation from Jordan. We even saw in Lebanon. We saw a couple of rockets come in from Lebanon. We saw much larger demonstrations outside. The question in Jerusalem is very sensitive because it would actually put on the fire in the entire Muslim world. Every Muslim Arab leader, every Muslim leader would be entitled to say, what the hell is Israel doing? You have to stop this. You can't just, it's not just their little playground, and they can't just go for Jewish supremacy across Jerusalem. We won't allow it. And if the government, and that's what people would be saying, and governments would be forced to take that position too. And there are governments like Saudi Arabia, United Emirates, Egypt, that are in very tricky situations, that are US allies that are in tricky situations that don't want that story to come up. So Biden administration came in at a certain point, and it was very obvious that they did this, and they basically said, look, okay, Netanyahu, he shut him down, basically, to be frank. And they said, we're going to go, we want you to go ceasefire now. It's a losing position that you're in right now. And de facto, they were losing, even though they obviously caused a lot of damage and death and destruction. And even though they didn't, the nature of the unilateral ceasefire was on both sides sort of stopping, I think there were certain understandings that were reached, at least on a regional level, with Egypt and Jordan, and also with the Palestinian Authority, and also probably indirectly with Hamas, that certain guarantees or certain things would, that they would work in certain directions, because also remember, on the other side of the coin, Netanyahu was just sort of very transparently being, obviously the whole issue thing is something quite transparent, in some public news, that the American Biden administration doesn't want to be seen, in the first couple of hundred days of his administration, just sort of supporting ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem.
And I think you sort of touched on something quite important, and that's the role. That's the role of sort of Western countries. In particular, we know that America is the largest provider of aid to Israel. They fund their military, they fund their weaponry, and in fact, they increase their funding of tune of $738 million in the middle of the attacks on Gaza, and yet couldn't come out and strongly criticize Israel vocally. And this is where we know that, on the ground, that's where, in terms of activists here on the ground in Melbourne, we try to put pressure on our governments, whether here in Australia, but also other activists around in America and around the world, trying to put pressure on our governments to hold Israel to account, because it cannot continue to act with impunity, as it has been. But how do you feel about the role that America played, in particular, during those attacks during Gaza and what's happening now in Sheikh Jarrah, and of the Biden administration? How do you feel of the way they've been handling the situation? Because I personally think it's been atrocious. And in fact, there's been a very major finding that's come out into the international community by Human Rights Watch, finding Israel is an apartheid state and commits crimes of apartheid, and it commits war crimes and crimes against humanity. And yet America is still very closely aligned with Israel. How do you feel about that dynamic there, in their recent behaviors by the Biden administration?
It's a good question. I think the Biden administration is very concerned about this, because the part of the issue was that the Trump's policies led to extreme polarization, which turned Israel into much more of a partisanal issue. Well, the truth was, what Trump was doing was he was taking U.S. policy down an extreme right-wing variant of Zionist politics, which is not necessarily America's traditional sort of liberal internationalist imperialism. And so Trump's policies alienated that wing of American ruling elite, which included the Democratic Party, which included also other parts of the capitalist class. So Biden is keen to correct that, but to attempt to realign American policy with that more traditionalist, liberal internationalist line, which was actually the line which brought you Oslo, which never solved anything, which created the problem, which created this conflict management situation, which allowed for Israel to, unleash what it has against the Palestinians for the last 30 years or more, sort of the guise of the peace process, which basically allowed Israel to continue it, gave Israel time to build more settlements, to make the possibility of Palestinian state or Palestinian national ambitions real. So Biden is keen to try and realign that, and he needs to do certain things with that. So I think what we witnessed with the Biden administration is actually the limitations and the end of the Trump line within limits, insofar as the American imperialism should not be subject or held hostage to basically some Jewish supremacist messianic run for the finish line, which Netanyahu and the settler goons around him and his government were basically doing. And he wants to, he's much more keen. He doesn't, at a time when he comes into power, basically, you have basically a major Palestinian victory, as well as a Palestinian popular victory, as well as Hamas victory, as well as, Israel's military strength is even like the military dynamics between Gaza and Israel that developed in the war are actually also quite problematic for Israel, insofar as now all of a sudden things you can cripple entire Israel with if things explode, and that's a problem. Before, it used to be just in the south. So and most of those rockets are actually created locally in Gaza. They're not like Iranian built or whatever they go after. So basically, and Biden, insofar as also is very aware that there is a left wing in the Democratic Party, as well as outside the Democratic Party, that are, so Biden's goal is to try and pull the Democratic Party to the center on all issues, not just on Palestine. But there is this autonomous Palestinian rights movement that exists there, penetrated the Democratic Party and the Congress, and it's a problem. So Biden has to fudge and say and spend money and do what he believes it will take. He doesn't care a damn about Palestinian rights. He's one of the most, he has that quotation where he says, if Israel doesn't exist, we would have to create Israel, basically. I mean, a very brazen way to say, like, we need to, this needs to be a Spartan US state in this region so that we basically keep the region down, basically. And that's Israel's role from an American perspective. They don't want continuity across this part of the Middle East, between Egypt and the Levant area, because it goes right through the Suez Canal. It's like, it's too key and strategic for them to basically allow it to take place. So they want that Spartan state in the middle, dividing the region up, and between the combination of the support for Israel on one hand and support for the Arab dictators on the other, to keep that sort of puppet dance going, basically, where everybody needs America and everybody goes to America and gets the weapons from them and we give them the oil and all this sort of stuff. And this is the dirty game. But the fact is, like, the polarization and the crisis that's taken place in the last few years has led to, and many factors have led to, new social movements that have been created and that are much more aware. And the Palestinian Solidarity Movement has also done huge amounts of work in the last 20-25 years, building a cadre of people who understand and who can explain things and who can make arguments to broader audiences and take this out. By the way, if you look at Biden, obviously he has he played very hard on trying to have this sort of multiracial, multi-gender kind of administration.
Yeah.
And he was actually, he's in, when South Africa was happening, you can find him online. He has, he tried to promote himself at the time as being this sort of a guy who was against, he wasn't with the Hawks. He was with sort of, South Africa is an abomination kind of thing, certainly by the end of it, you see what I'm saying? So he's soft from that side of him, So when he hears Octavio Ortiz and whoever saying, anyone talking about apartheid or human rights, by the way, it's not, you don't need Octavio Ortiz talking about about apartheid or Human Rights Watch. You have former Israeli prime ministers talking about this fear. You have the two former Israeli ambassadors to South Africa, basically, just 2 days ago, making a declaration that it's apartheid, at least in the West Bank and in the OPT areas. So, I mean, basically, for anybody to say it's not apartheid at this point is basically anti-intellectual. I mean, it's not, it doesn't fly. So the question is, like, how do you sort of avoid that, that 800-pound gorilla in the room, that it's obviously an apartheid situation? And they're desperately trying to maneuver to try and do that, so they're doing that by trying to throw money at the Palestinian Authority, by trying to give Jordan some sort of concessions around that they're going to push back on the Saudi Arabian push to get rid of them off of East Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa. This was a Trump policy. The Trumps were basically trying to get rid of the Jordanian monarchy together with Netanyahu, because they thought it was too concessionary on the Palestinian cause and Al-Aqsa. So basically, Trump lit all these fuses and pissed a hell of a lot of people off. Least of which was the Palestinians, but like traditional U.S. allies, basically. Now Biden has to come around and sort of pay the piper a little bit, and not pay the piper. That's not the allegory I'm after, but kind of put some fires out, basically, because at the end, yeah.
Yeah, and I would add that what Trump also did was that he also gave people a way to fight back against his really right-wing and reactionary views, because we saw the rise of the Black Lives Movement and the anti-racist movement, and there were real ways in which people were engaging politically and understanding the role of systemic racism and systemic oppression. And it gave there an opportunity for that dialogue and for that conversation to be had. So people's awareness has been very much more, I think, developed after that point. But I do actually, just before I finish, I'd love to open up the discussion to the floor. So if anyone would like to be involved in the discussion, please raise your hand if you want to contribute via mic. And if you'd like to contribute in the discussion, feel free to send through a question through the chat group. I will keep an eye out for anyone's hand raised up on the mic, but I do have a question for you that was raised from the chat group. A gentleman noted, as a Palestinian, I live in the diaspora. I advocate and fight every day for our right to return and justice. I do, however, feel every day as well that I'm not on the ground like the rest of my family. Please let me know what people on the ground really want and need from us outside of Palestine to support the uprising and resistance of further ethnic cleansing. Is it more BDS, more than posting and sharing and speaking about Palestinian lives and the situation? What else can people do to fight back and bring awareness around Palestine? So that's a question from someone from the chat group. Thank you, everyone. But anyone else who does have a question who would like to contribute via the mic, please put your hand up. Toufic, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. Maybe I'll take up that question. Let folks write up questions in the chat or whatnot. I mean, it's an excellent question. I think a lot of Palestinians have that dilemma, and they don't know what to do. With that said, I think, to be very frank, and the most important thing Palestinians and solidarity activists can do is to build effective, broad, large, powerful movements for political change. Like Palestinians will have a particular role in that, insofar as they themselves are victims and are direct stakeholders. But I think the obligation will be to not just to create moral appeal around our cause, but also make the claim that there is that the domestic audiences, non-Palestinians in their communities, are also stakeholders in this, insofar as, and this is obviously particular towards Western countries like Australia, that Australians, Australian tax money, and at first, it's not within the interests of the average Australian citizen that their money and tax money goes to protect and to defend and to facilitate Israeli apartheid and Palestinian oppression. And that's the basic case that we need to do. Now, then the real question, I would argue, is to take it a little bit further, which is that in addition to sort of obviously building these broad alliances, we need to be strategic about how we build our campaigns. The architecture of, let's put it broadly speaking, pro-Zionist politics in a place like around the world is different in each locality. Okay, it doesn't look the same in Belgium as it does in Czechoslovakia, or it does in North America or Mexico or Australia. Okay, different countries hold different weights and are doing different things vis-a-vis Israel and play different facilitation roles or not. Okay, so we need to really study the local context that we're in, and it's not. There's the Australian level of it, and then there's like the Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney level of it. Can we study like what are those connections? Can you map what the connections of Zionist institutions and propagation of Zionist policies are in those localities, and then build broad alliances with fellow actors, Palestinian, non-Palestinian, because we need. It's very clear that Palestine is an issue that there's many things. There should be broad potential for alliance from Christian groups to Muslim groups to leftists to liberals. Okay, and there's no reason why we can't and shouldn't build these. So what I suggest is that we really study the local context and build and in particular identify what I would probably call low-lying fruit, like in the sense of perhaps the most egregious examples of, let's say in the case of settlements, you have some of these groups that are pushing these ethnic cleansing campaigns in Sheikh Jarrah that have charitable status in some Western countries. Okay, I mean, charitable status is supposed to be for public good, not for ethnic cleansing and colonization. I mean, they're using tax loopholes to launder money for ethnic cleansing. I mean, what the hell is that? Like, so, I mean, you've got a very obvious case of something that's what I would call like an egregious example of egregious racism, colonialism, some very dirty aspect of how all these politics fit together and use the institution of the Israelis, of the Australian state or of the Western state to facilitate that. And then once that research has been well done, then you make appeals to that broad coalition, say, look, let's mobilize resources collectively around this and let's really push for this. Because if you can break that, you can basically, you break open an issue that has a microcosm of much larger issues in it, okay? And it's much easier to go after low-lying fruit than it is unripe fruit, I mean, in some circles amongst liberals, you'll have the idea that liberal Zionism is still should be supported, but liberal Zionists cannot support or don't support generally those heavy settler groups. The other thing I think that's important is really to look at to connect it to the social movements and social causes inside the domestic countries. I mean, in the United States, for instance, which I know a little better than Australia, but I imagine Australia, there's something comparable. The churches, I mean, there are tens of millions of Christian Zionists in the United States, okay? Like in all of America, there's more Jews in America than there are in Australia, but they are, I mean, whatever, let's say something like 7 million. I mean, it's not even about being Jewish is not a category. It doesn't mean you're Zionist. What I'm basically trying to say is like you have huge socio-political sectors like the Christian Zionists who play a huge role in fact, Israel is much more interested at this stage in actually maintaining and deepening and widening its relationship with Christian Zionists than they are with Jews in the West, because they understand they've already split the Jewish community, and now that you have this you know, running wild left-wing Jewish anti-Zionist folks, you know, who are, you know, causing a lot of problems for that. And obviously, you know, what a lot of these Christian Zionist groups are heavily implicated in, you know, reactionary agendas domestically, whether it's around gender rights or sexuality or abortion or whatever. You also have, you know, the surveillance security state that is taking place, that those processes of control that are sort of encroaching across all forms of, you know, of civic and liberal. What, you know, we used to be much more free before all these things, and now all of a sudden we're super controlled and super surveilled by everybody. And Israel has played a key role in that process of surveillance capitalism that has sort of developed,
Oh yeah,
and which is
definitely.
in with other forms of capitalism and stuff. So pointing those things out, both the connections with the domestic as well as the actual Palestinian cause and the facilitation of the domestic to the local here are all key areas where we can build strong coalitions. And if we do our research well, and then also prepare our media strategies well, prepare our legal defenses well, you can force issues that become wedge, you understand? And then you force that wedge, basically. So those are the kinds of activities that I think that, you know, and Palestinians can play a particular role, and solidarity activists can play a particular role, but they're both somewhat stakeholders in different ways.
In different ways, yeah, absolutely. We do have, I believe, Jamil, you have your hand up to ask a question of Toufic. Would you like to say something?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the excellent presentation as well. It's been very informative. I've got two questions. One is on this new wave or generation of protests or resistance in historic Palestine. Questions about current morale networks forming and the politics of it. So it's incredible how the Palestinian struggle can flow to across the world. So in Melbourne, we saw the largest pro-Palestinian rally in its history just a couple of weeks ago. And it was largely the resistance that lifted the morale and got people on the streets as well. And we saw that in number of, well, not just the West, but in Jordan, there were significant protests as well. And you mentioned that, I mean, historically as well, Palestinian protests have helped to destabilize Arab nations, or at least bring people on the streets, which has strengthened the movement. And that's been a core part of at least the historic perspective of the Palestinian left, and where they think that their strength lies as well, not just Palestinians in historic Palestine, but outside. So as well as that, we saw, I mean, small achievements of this wave of protests, from the stopping settlement march reach Al-Aqsa, to postponing of some parts of the ethnic cleansing in Sheikh Jarrah, and then a national strike. And although it may not be the Palestinian labor may not be as critical to the Israeli economy, it still had a political strength to it that I'd imagine must have been impactful for the resistance movement in historic Palestine. It definitely was significant for the diaspora and raising morale and getting them on the streets, I'd say, as well. So in that context, is there a politics to the movement other than just looking for any forms of resistance that is available to them? And then the second one, a quicker question, is, I think sometime today, I believe in the Knesset, there's going to be a vote for a new coalition. If you could, and the potential new prime ministers know better than Netanyahu, if you could say a couple of things on Naftali Bennett and the potential new coalition, and it's the approach to the colonial project, how it may differ or not. We may not know, but if you've got any insights on that, I think that would be valuable.
Okay. I think So on the first question about the politics, morale, and networks of these sort of new movements, I think it's important to acknowledge they're quite new, so it's something under formation. I think probably the most significant things, you really see this actually in two areas. You see it in 48 areas and you see it in Jerusalem. It's not so much a factor in the West Bank, and in Gaza, it's as far as I know, it's not so much a factor. And that's because I think in Gaza you have, both at Gaza and the West Bank, you have much more established institutional Palestinian politics that are still the main players in terms of being actors on the political scene, and which means that they have longer term strategies and approaches that are taking place. That's not to say that their bases, I think, are wanting to move and do things, and I think there is activity on that level, and we will see more activity coming up from the West Bank, at least. But the real places where you see these new networks being formed is like in Jerusalem and in 48 areas. And I think it's a little early to call it an intifada. I think the strike was obviously very key in terms of having like an actual singular event where all Palestinians were able to sort of come out and participate. And after that, you saw certain folks coming out and saying that this is intifada al-wahda wal-karama, like the intifada of unity and of dignity, basically. And I think those values of unity and dignity are kind of important because they speak to the sense to which Palestinians felt that their existence was becoming undignified or had become undignified, and that the fragmentation that had taken place was around was wide and large. So just having common days and common actions of protest was important for people to assert that they're still a people, that everyone is in this together, and that we're fighting a common enemy, which was actually a way to push back against Israel's, fragmentationist policies vis-a-vis it. Now, of course, Israel is going to keep on trying to divide and rule all these areas, and they have the infrastructure to do that under Oslo. But I think having gone through that mental process and also that political process, an experiential one of having the strike and going through what we just did, people are entering this new phase of struggle of people looking and exploring and trying to understand how best they can take this struggle forward. And when it comes to the actual politics and networks of these people, it's not so clear where they will take it. I think that's a question for all political actors as well. One, I would argue that relates to the diaspora as well, because the folks in the diaspora are also part of the Palestinian struggle. But, you see interesting things like in 48, like I said, because the colonial control is different in each area and looks different, and there's different sets of rights and different historical dynamics of protests that have taken on, you have different types of mobilization. So the nature right now inside 48 in particular is around trying to set up defense committees for neighborhoods and for people against the vigilante attacks by the settlers who went on pogroms in some of their neighborhoods, but also defense campaigns for folks who were arrested. I mean, they had more than 2,000 people arrested in the last 2 weeks. In Jerusalem, you have a little, everyone has their own constellation of networks. And I think you do see much more joint organizing amongst different factions around trying to find common, for instance, people don't think that Jerusalem actually does have a factional political, but the factions are just underground, and you actually have much more factional unity in Jerusalem than you do in the West Bank, where they're seen as enemies, basically. So I don't know. I think it remains to be seen. I think they are obviously informed by the history of the struggle, and then I think there They also recognize the importance of being able to speak to the West and outside as a key arena, which means they have to be able to speak a little bit more in terms and ideas that will be able to work with them. And I think, so, you know, I think it's subject to political actors to articulate exactly how that takes place. And it's not an easy task, to be honest, but I guess we'll see. I mean, the most immediate thing, I mean, you don't have to have brilliant politics to say, look, Silwan is about to have 1,500 people who are in threat of having their houses demolished. They gave them orders just a few days ago that, you know, 1,500 people could either have to destroy their own houses or will be forced to pay the cost of the demolition of their own houses in some sort of sadistic sort of occupation policy. And, you know, the clock is ticking there. I mean, you don't need to be a freaking Marxist or a liberal or you know, you just need to be a humanist for that, you know, but we need to be mobilized, I think, is probably the most important thing. Rather than going through the, you know, specificity. I mean, all of the political differences are important and tactics are important, but I think at this stage, what Palestinians recognize is they need broad coalitions, both locally and outside, fighting for their cause, because the fragmentation has not been that helpful in recent years, and it's weakened the cause on a macro level. When it comes to the new Israeli government, to the next set of questions, you know, I think it's, firstly, I will say I don't think Netanyahu is out. I think his base is the most organized and the most militant, and they have a lot of axes to grind, both domestic, nothing to do with the Palestinians, as well as those to do with the Palestinians. You know, and the new, and chiefly here, not, you know, I think it's worth pointing out to listeners that, you know, the entire new coalition is entirely Ashkenazi oriented. All the leaders of it from the European Ashkenazi extraction, together with the Russians, which are sort of a bit of category for themselves. They have maybe two posts that are sort of very soft Mizrahi, sort of who come from other origins other than Eastern Europe. But so this is certainly an underlying driving and you know, a huge fault line in Israeli politics that's very much active right now. And under Corona politics, you also had this sort of fragmentation of the Israeli polity. So the coalition that was able to coalesce at the last moment to be able to come up with an opposition party to finally push Netanyahu out of power, to be frank, you know, contains so many contradictions to it that it's unlikely that they'll be able to take any serious steps in any one direction or another. Certainly nothing big, but if it perhaps, I mean, they were united in their opposition to Netanyahu, but not united in their politics around anything particular. So that's basically a recipe for them to collapse at a certain point, and probably not too much in the near future. I wouldn't give them, you know, well, who knows? I don't want to speculate too much. But Netanyahu is also a very crafty person and knows the political system, and he's also been able to put a lot of his people in a lot of parts of the state for the last 14 or 12 years or whatever it's been. So you do see this continual, but the point is, it's not. This is the illusion of the Israeli state. It's not that like, oh, Netanyahu's in, he's against peace, and now the left is, you know. It's not about the government. It's about, you have a whole state, a whole apparatus that is in place that has been implementing incremental policies. And to be frank, the real, who runs Israel? It's the freaking army. It's not, it's the army and it's the United States. Okay, it's like basically, I mean, it's the United States which gives $38 billion, which ensures the solvency and the buoyancy of the Israeli military arms complex. You know, it's the army which does the basic, you know, oversees the infrastructure of oppression and of control, both inside 48 as well as inside 67 and inside Gaza. And the political class inside Israel is just sort of there to sort of like mediate the intra-Israeli differences and then sort of push things a little bit this way or a little bit that way pertaining to the context. And so we shouldn't be under any illusions that that massive infrastructure of control, of apartheid, of occupation, of Zionist ideology, which is deep and which has been going in a deep direction of Judeo-supremacist messianism, is active and alive and well irrigated. Actually, something to pay attention to, I would argue, that's quite significant here is because Netanyahu was unseated, or appears to be unseated today. One thing we noticed is, remember when things took place inside 48, when things were kicking off, you had these right-wing Jewish settler groups going around, conducting pogroms and sort of, destroying Arab property and beating people up and even killing people. And
lynching people.
Lynching people, absolutely, on live television. And these vigilantism is something that happens, amongst other things, when not only when it's encouraged by the state, but also when these elements feel that the state doesn't do enough to protect them, and they want and they are entitled to more protection, and they'll do it with their own hands. So you have a 9 times increase in the number of firearms that the Israelis are purchasing right now, that Israeli Jews are purchasing right now. I mean, this is, and the fact that now a quote unquote slightly more left Zionist government will potentially could come into power, obviously run by this extreme right-wing Jewish settler group. I mean, that's why the right left-wing divide is sort of bogus inside Israel. But the point is, where am I going with this? It means that the Netanyahu base, who see themselves as victimized and historically disenfranchised by the Ashkenazi establishment, and who were socially rising under the context of Netanyahu, which is not necessarily recognized by outside forces. It's something you have to be inside Israeli Jewish society to appreciate and recognize, and those internal tensions. Though there's certainly going to be elements of that who are not going to think that they have that this new constellation of opposition groups which are going to run Israel are going to protect them and their interests and their families and their settlements and etc. So I am quite concerned of the possibility of acts of terror against Palestinian communities, whether inside 48 Palestine or inside Jerusalem, and we saw this during the episodes as well, where right-wing groups and settler groups were coming through the neighborhood. They were firing on the neighborhood in Sheikh Jarrah here. They were we saw them in 48, and we also saw them in the West Bank. There are groups out there who are armed and very dangerous, and they feel that they have a God-given right to what they're doing, and if they feel that they're going to be out of power or out of thing, they're very dangerous people. So folks should be very, very aware of this.
Yeah, I think, Toufic, you touched on something really important, which is for Palestinians, regardless of whatever government it is, it's the same story. It's the same system of oppression. It's the same settler colonial state, which is why continued solidarity and resistance against Israel is really important. And this is a time I think I want to highlight that we actually do have a protest organised on the 3rd of July, 1 p.m. at the State Library. I know that recently in Melbourne we are in lockdown, and this is a really great opportunity for those of you guys to come out in solidarity with Palestine. The fight isn't over. We will still need to resist Israeli oppression. Just because the ceasefire ended a few weeks ago, as Toufic has very clearly highlighted, the struggle is still ongoing, and the Israeli state, no matter who's in power, is going to consistently push its own program of ethnic cleansing and apartheid. So please come along to the protest on the 3rd of July at 1 p.m. in front of the State Library. We do have time for one more question, which I'm going to put that to you now, Toufic, before we wrap up. It's from our question is from a young woman, I believe. It is, what is the solidarity like on the ground between the Israelis themselves? We see so many contradictions between the people there. You have hard-out Zionists, Europeans, Americans that are reckless, like you're talking about now. And then there are some Israelis that are of my generation that are now refusing to join the IDF and have been jailed for it. Unlike Palestinians who are all united across 48 Gaza, West Bank, East Jerusalem, and diaspora. Being there in Palestine, do you feel the cracks within their side, so within the Israeli side?
We definitely feel the cracks. I don't think that's anything new though. And I don't feel that forms the basis of a new movement, unfortunately. Like, I think Palestinians do not, there are demonstrations. I'll tell you something. There's been a weekly demonstration in Sheikh Jarrah run by the Israeli left for the last 5 years. Every Friday at just before Shabbat kicks off, around 4 to 6 p.m., somewhere around there, they come and they protest down there. They get a permit for it. Palestinians don't get their permits, don't even apply. But they're largely Jewish demonstrations. You have different elements of Israeli society that that are more. Some of them are more pro-Palestinian, and you find elements of young folks inside Israel who are inspired by the Palestinian struggle. But you do not, to be very frank, the numbers are very small. Like, you do not have numbers more than 70, 80 people at those demonstrations, and of which parts of them will also be 48 Palestinians who come in from, overall, you have the larger tendency in politics in Israeli society is way pushing things rightwards again, right? In inverted commas in the last 20 years. And that's unquestionable. If there's been any kind, and all the opinion polls show that, if there's the refusal to serve in the Israeli army is actually not a significant feature right now. I mean, I don't want to discount individual cases of people have taken brave stances. There's a lot of people who get out of the army and who kind of escape through this sort of like, oh, I have mental problems and I don't want to, but they're not, obviously they're doing it for political purposes, but then they also don't want to entirely destroy their future because Israel gives a whole set of privileges according to if you've actually gone to the army or not, and like for what reasons you didn't go to the army and all this sort of stuff. So I don't think we can actually speak of a significant break inside Israeli society that is necessarily going to break towards a pro-Palestine agenda or anything. You do not witness that anywhere. I mean, you witness, as you always had, important individual voices that may be making statements or claims or protests even, but they have not been able to sort of demonstrate considerable leverage or even to be able to reach out to Palestinians. And there's still large elements of Palestinian society. Most of Palestinian society actually doesn't trust the existence of an Israeli anti-Zionist left to be created or to exist, to be frank, because if you
what's the history, really, isn't it, of the Palestinian experience?
I mean, the left was in liberal Zionism was interested in how to solve their Palestine problem, not to realize Palestinian liberation or justice or rights. So the typical liberal Zionist approach, which said the best way to deal with the situation is to create some kind of Palestinian state. I mean, basically, that gave the sort of opening for Oslo to happen, but it led to the autonomy agreement. And they didn't actually protest the autonomy agreement. They didn't protest apartheid. They didn't protest the fact that Jerusalem's unified capital of the Israeli state. They never supported Palestinian refugee rights to return. They don't consider settlements in Jerusalem settlements. Like, so there's a whole, if you say, oh, the Palestinians should have a real state with the potential for a real army, they're like, no, actually no army. So, I mean, because it was founded actually by Israeli military generals, actually the Israeli, what's called the Israeli left, which basically said this policy of taking over the entirety of historical Palestine and running it that way is actually not going to work in the long term for us because whatever reasons they had. So there was an internal debate amongst Israelis about how best to control the Palestinians. And that debate ultimately was temporarily won by the liberals because it was the apartheid solution. The Likud is still waiting for its opportunity to actually conduct the ethnic cleansing. So, I mean, that's what we have to realize, which is what is going on here. So I don't see it as significant. What I see is much more significant. And obviously, Israeli society has always been hugely fragmented, and Corona made this much, much worse. You have you know, because remember also these dynamics that I mentioned, like the sort of the Mizrahi Sephardic sort of Ashkenazi divide, as well as the religious non-religious. I mean, the religious non-religious is just because like the Haredim, which are the Orthodox community, which are not religious, which represent about 15% of the population, you know, were seen to have been like this sort of, you know, because they didn't really abide by and they don't want to deal with the state so much. They had very high corona cases. Obviously, their conditions of where they live is actually much worse, and they're much more densely populated. And because they don't serve in the state, they have much crappier conditions. So they actually became the scapegoats of the liberal Zionists and other elements of the Zionism that were like looking towards them. But in addition to the fact that there was huge ignorance amongst them, and there was huge, you had cases of huge like funerals and yeshivas doing stuff, you know, abiding by corona regulations because they have their own messianic interpretation of life. So, you know, I don't know what to say. Both of those issues are very, very live wire issues inside Israeli politics, but it's not to the advantage of the Palestinians at this stage. The more significant advantage is and political turn you see is the turn between Israel as the representative of the Jewish state, the Jewish people around the world, and actually the Jewish people around the world were like, I don't want anything to do with this, you know, with this state and what it's doing. And that divide is obviously getting much larger, more militant, and that's a huge boon to the Palestinian cause, because Jewish allies in the struggle are very obviously important in their own right, because they cultivate voices and they create voices that say, you know, this has nothing to do with you know, ending anti-Semitism. This is settler colonialism. This is, you know, this is reactionary crap that's, you know, some sort of imperial colonial agenda, and it doesn't protect Jews or anything, you know. And actually, we have, you know, the better way to fight anti-Semitism is to like fight against racism and support the Palestinians and oppose Israeli racism. And
exactly.
So.
Yeah, and I would say in terms of us here in Australia and around the world, that's the fight that we have. We have a fight against colonialism, a fight against racism, a fight against oppression, a fight for basic, you know, for humanity, a fight against Israelis' extreme violence and racism and apartheid nature, but also its acts of impunity. And for those who are here who wanting to, you know, join in that fight for Palestinian liberation and for, you know, to hold Israel accountable for its war crimes, please feel free to join in with Free Palestine Melbourne. I can see there's been a few conversations of how to get involved. You can jump on those socials on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, but also there's a Free Palestine website. We'll have all that information listed. So please jump on there and get involved. The meetings will happen either based in person, that'll be posted up in advance, or during COVID lockdown will be held over Zoom every second Saturday of the month. To anyone who would like to get involved in the campaign against for Palestine but against Israeli atrocities, please join Free Palestine Melbourne. You can also send in an email to fpmelbourne.com. But thank you so much, Toufic. Just wrapping up now, thank you so much for coming and speaking to us from Sheikh Jarrah. You are just absolutely wonderful. And I think for a lot of people who are joining in today, they may not understand the historical context or some of the fine details around what it's like for Palestinians to live under Israeli apartheid and the struggles that we face. So thank you so much for providing that information. And I just want to add that for Palestinians, this is a fight for liberation. It's a fight against anti-racism, and it's a fight against apartheid. So thank you everyone who joined us in today, and thank you so much, Toufic. We're here to stand in solidarity with you. We will continue campaigning for a free Palestine and a time to also visit you there in Palestine without being denied by the Israeli state. Thank you so much. You were fantastic.
Thank you, I just wanted to say thank you as well. Also from Free Palestine Melbourne, I want to thank everyone for joining, and we'll see hopefully everyone at the protest on the 3rd of July. But thank you so much for joining us and coming in. You gave us so much knowledge and information, and we appreciate
if I
everything.
could end what we're saying, one thing, we have them on the run, okay? It's a different, it's a new era that's open up. And that's why we need what they call full court press, you know, in basketball or whatnot. So build those coalitions, don't look back. I think we've got it's much more easy to build campaigns when the Palestinians are motivated and they've shown that people want to, you know, be part of movements that are, so solidarity around being a victim is not very empowering, but when you see people take agency and take their fight into their own hands like they've been doing here, it's very inspiring. And it's both inspiring for the Palestinian cause as well as for what you could do locally. So I think we need to take advantage of that momentum and push forward. So I wish you luck, and I'm happy to help with anything that I can on my side.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're really grateful that you could join us today.
Exactly.
I really thank you for on that note as well, because like the way we frame solidarity here as well is to say we're in solidarity with the uprising and with you know, the movement on the ground, not necessarily in solidarity with victims of atrocities. So that there is that distinction, which I appreciate you making.
Absolutely. And in that note, if everyone please join us for the protest on the 3rd of July, 1 p.m. at the State Library. We stand in solidarity with the Palestinians fighting for their freedom. Thank you, everyone. See you. See you, everyone.
Thanks, guys. If you guys want to stick around, we can talk a little bit before we close.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit.
Yeah.
We'll wait.
Thank you, May. That was great.
Thanks, guys. I thought Toufic was going to give a little excerpt, but that's okay. I had questions ready. But I thought that's why in the thought I was like, yeah, he's going to give a talk. I thought there was like a little intro talk, but okay. Never mind.
Yeah, before we start talking, I've just been bumping people to the waiting room, so it's just people we know. Who's this other person? Free.
iPhone.
Oh, I don't know. May, I don't know.
No, not me.
He was great. He was really good.
As always.
Yeah, he was great. Oh, so you met him, May?
Yes, I have.
We went out for a coffee. Did you date him?
Coffee. We went out to a few restaurants on Lygon Street, and we went to the zoo.
Oh,
a few years ago.
Awesome.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah. That's great.
He's so funny actually in person. He's a funny guy. By the way,
I felt like he was really serious today. Like it's like he had this like response. I don't know, like this.
I think he felt shocked because at the start he said, oh, I thought that was a discussion. Then he was shocked with the amount of people, maybe.
How many did we have? I'm just curious.
We had around 77.
Wow.
79 at one point.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I saw 79. It's really good.
Wow, that's fantastic. I kept getting some weird person direct messaging me some inappropriate stuff.
I'll just block him.
Yeah, I was listening to it, but it was some very inappropriate gifts.
Next time you can tell a host and we can I kicked 2 people out during the meeting.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, he did it briefly and then he went away. So I'm assuming he was probably doing other stuff. He kicked him out for other things. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't see that. Yeah, we can all.
I didn't see it. It was private to you, May, maybe.
Yeah, it was private.
Oh my God.
And I was just like, I'm going to focus on to what Toufic was saying. I'm like, I don't have time to be typing this, but didn't respond. But I was like, that's interesting. I haven't had emojis like that sent to me in a long time.
Oh, wow.
Well done, everyone.
Well done. Thank you.
I thought it was good. And
right.
I think I didn't recognize half the people.
Yeah, me too.
Great questions, by the way, Danielle. Yours were really great.
Oh, Geordie was on. Geordie came in, which was good. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, 79 people. That's fantastic.
Yeah, well done, guys. We'll talk about so now main focus is to build up the rally, but we'll see how things go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, this is still recording.